Happy Halloween to everyone. You've all chosen a very spooky topic tonight. How we get along with each other or not across Atlantic. When I have to think about the European Union, I always think about it as an American, that I would say it's the most important organization in the world to which Americans don't belong. And for that reason, I think often we don't quite understand it. When we think often of the transatlantic relationship, we're in NATO, we think of being part of something. But the European Union is we have very dense relations with the European Union. But it's never quite been the same type of strategic relationship that we have known with NATO and obviously different fields of endeavor. So we'd like to unpack that a little bit and talk about the issues that we're facing today. Austria, this term, has the presidency, and so there's a little Austrian flavor to this, but those of you who know something about the European Union know that presidency rotates among member states. So Austria has presidency right now, but as at the turn of the year it moves on. And that's why the Commission the European Commission plays more of this continuing role. But we'll get into some of that. I'd like to just have a discussion, I think, among our colleagues here. Moderated discussion, back and forth, no long speeches. And then we'd like to turn to the audience so that we can all have a discussion and also hear your comments or answer questions you might have. So if that's okay with you, I'd like to just start us off. Perhaps Othmar, who's come the distance from represent both the Austrian presidency but also the European Parliament. What do you think right now, from your vantage point, is the top issue we're facing, either between us or the issue that we face together? What's on the top of your list that we should be thinking about?
Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, thank you to Ambassador Waltner and the Johns Hopkins University for inviting me and for organizing this event. Secondly, I came not from the European Union. I am a European. I'm coming from New York. We met in the last 4 days the United Nations, also the Secretary General, and I think we discussed in the last days the same issues we will discuss also today. And so it is very clear, many of the challenges we face today are interconnected. And the European Parliament, I have to explain, is the only one multinational parliament, direct elected with a legal power. So you can see the European Parliament and the European Union is a project. We are not ready. We are looking forward. We have to solve the problems who are on the table. We are not ready. We are going forward. For me, in the first round, I have 3 topics. The first, I think we have to gather in our common world a crisis of multilateralism. In my understanding, multilateralism is cooperation. But on the other hand, we have a debate, and I think we can see it everywhere. At the moment, some continents have a different definition of multilateralism, like the US. Some, we have a new definition. It's in opposite to my understanding of multilateralism. Some think we have a competition between different models. We have new crises and not only cooperation. So that is the reason why I will say we have a crisis of multilateralism. Secondly, we have a deficit of trust. Thirdly, we are all under stress. We are under stress for 2 reasons: of internal factors, populism, protectionism, nationalism, black and white thinking, and a new rhetoric. Our wording we use as politicians is not always very fair. is not very tolerant. It's extreme. It's splitting our society. Then are the internal factors we face, and the external factors, also for the European Union, why we are under stress is the development in China, in Russia, and in the United States. I think what Russia and the United States unite is both, that is my feeling, will divide the European Union. They will not only discuss with the European Union, with the European Commission as a whole. We will start a new form of bilateralism, and that is so different to China. In China we have the situation, I think, a better understanding of multilateralism. That is the reason why to cooperate on the WTO discussion and issues, it is at this time easier to cooperate with China as with the United States or Russia.
Thank you. So, Stu, if I could turn to you. Othmar is mentioning sort of some intangible factors. Context is maybe the most important. Besides multilateralism as a challenge, you talked about a lack of trust. We're under stress. You could say that about on both sides of the Atlantic, each society, not necessarily, and maybe also between. But Stu, I wonder, I know you think about the overall relationship very deeply.
Thank you, Dino. It's an honor to be here. I want to congratulate the Austrian government on its presidency. I was at a conference in Rabat just a day or two ago with the foreign minister, and I also want to congratulate you on the fact that in Berlin at the end of November, it will be the 20th anniversary of the Washington Principles on Nazi Regard, which I negotiated. And as I told the distinguished head of your national fund, Panelists, today, I'll be using those remarks in part to hold Austria up as the prime example of the way in which those principles should be implemented. You've done a splendid, remarkable job. Now on this topic, on March the 5th, 1946, Winston Churchill at Westminster College in the tiny town of Fulton, Missouri, said, "From Stettin in the Baltics to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." I don't want to be melodramatic, but in our time, and in less poetic terms, from the UK to the US, from Brazil to Italy, from Poland to Hungary, even in Sweden, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany, a new populism has descended on the entire continent of Europe, the United States, and parts of Latin America. President Trump has brilliantly captured a movement with his America First concept and catalyzed and encouraged similarly elected presidents and prime ministers in many of these countries. The discontent was brewing before our eyes, but we were blind to it. At least some of us were blind to it. In the U.S., it was 3 decades of stagnant growth and middle-class wages, in which almost all the wealth that was created was at the top 5%, leading to a historic income disparity. The 2008 financial crisis, which hit Europe as well as the United States, displaced millions of people from their homes and jobs, and it took the U.S. government under President Bush and then President Obama to come up with a TARP program to bail them out. I supported that, I continue to support it, but it caused tremendous anger on the part of many Americans who saw no bailout for them and a bailout for the banks with no penalties for the heads of those banks who had caused the problem. Add to that the ferocious pace of technological change in our digital era, and you have a loss of jobs, and in the United States, which has always been an optimistic country, but for the first time polls showing that people think conditions will be worse for their children than for themselves rather than better. In such an environment, scapegoats are easy to find. And the connective thread with all the populist movements, in my opinion, again, from Italy and Brazil, to the United States, to the UK, and across the continent in Europe, is immigration. It's the Poles in the UK, it's the Hispanics, immigrants in the US, it's the Muslims in Europe. When you have a country like, say, the Netherlands, with 17 million people, they take 1.5 million Muslims. Take Germany, 1 million in 1 year. Sweden, 150,000 in 2015, and a country of 10 million. And people feel that their culture, the face of their country, is at risk, that their public services are being pressed, that their jobs are being displaced. This creates a very volatile and dangerous environment. In the US, President Trump has added to that the trade factory, arguing somehow that we've been ripped off for decades, and the reason we have trade deficits is not due to macroeconomic factors, it's due to the fact we've been quote-unquote duped into seeking bad trade agreements. And therefore the response has been, remarkably, the use of almost never used, and Dan Hamilton is one of the experts on this, trade remedies like Section 301, Section 232, which have rarely, if ever, been used, and certainly very rarely against allies. And it's been used against the EU, it's been used against Japan, and obviously against China. We can come to that later. By doing so against European allies, instead of using them to coalesce with us against the clearly unfair trade practices of China, it's divided us. And this is not useful. In addition, the President's question, Article 5 of NATO, has said that the European Union was created as a method of competing with us on trade. The WTO is at risk, and remarkably, a distrust of multilateral and regional agreements. Withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from NAFTA, from the nuclear agreement with Iran, the JCPOA, with potential secondary sanctions coming up against European countries who will continue to do business with Iran. The Paris climate change negotiations, that negotiated Kyoto in the Clinton administration. And soon, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement with Russia. So on trade, what the President's done, and done it very cleverly and quite well, is used the power of the U.S. economy to bring countries to their knees and to move for new agreements with South Korea, a new NAFTA type agreement, first getting a deal with Mexico and then putting pressures on Canada, getting Juncker to have to come to Washington and agree that he will try to enter into a harmonization on low tariffs. So we have a very combustible mix. I hope we'll be able to talk about that in our session about how to deal with it. But again, let's not lose the forest for the trees when we start talking about how we deal with one problem or another with Russia and China. There is a global issue. It's this very rapid growth of populist movements, and that to me is the overarching issue of our time and of our relationship with Europe as well.
Thank you, Stu. So Bob, if I could ask, both of the first two speakers suggest that we're facing similar phenomena across the Atlantic, many of the same challenges. Stu, of course, says the President has sort of taken that and pushed it on his own profile. So I just wonder, as a Republican, whether you agree with that. Do you agree we share sort of similar problems across the Atlantic, or do you see something distinctive as a problem that we face across the Atlantic between us?
No, I think we live in a world that is undergoing extraordinary change. We literally have 4 revolutions happening simultaneously. There's an economic revolution, there's a political revolution, there's a technological revolution, and there's a cultural revolution, all of which are happening simultaneously. And when you get that kind of situation, what it creates is instability, and it creates uncertainty. And the reaction to that by many people is a reaction of pulling inside, of pulling back as individuals, or as individual nations, and looking to solve the problems as singular items rather than looking at the broader picture. And I think that's what you're seeing played out. I agree with Stu that as you look across the world, this is not just an American phenomenon. This is a world phenomenon, and it's largely driven by fear. You have lots of people who are afraid that the skills that they have don't translate into that new economic and technological world. It is a situation where many people don't feel as though they are listened to and are looking for leaders who they believe listen to their concerns and to their fears. And it plays itself out in some of President Trump's language, but it is also the question of the average person out there that doesn't have an understanding of all the dynamics, but he does or she does recognize that this is having an impact. And they see it as an elitist kind of impact. When they talk about globalism, it's an elitist term in the way that they look at it. And so we get a politics that plays that out. The fact is that President Trump has caught a lot of that concern, a lot of that emotion, and has used it in the development of a number of policies that, in fact, that at least in the short term have been pretty successful. As Stu mentioned, the trade deals are things that made many of us concerned when you start talking about moving away from a free trade regime. But the fact is that NAFTA was in need of reform, and at the end of the day, what you got was not a new treaty or a new agreement. But what you got was a modification of the old agreement that actually made some sense in terms of the reforms that it presented. We've been trying to negotiate with the South Koreans and with the Japanese for a long, long time on some of the very items that the president was able to carry forward. I think at the end of the day, China will also have a problem in terms of maintaining a stance that does not appreciate its access to the American markets. And so we're seeing the whole thing play out globally, but it starts with very much of this populism that is based upon individual power. I often think to myself, in the Cold War, we all feared Russia, in large part because of the chance that we could be annihilated by nuclear weapons. Today, the weapon that they use is our telephones. It's a huge change in terms of the power of individuals, but also the impact on individuals.
Thank you. So David, now everyone has sort of said we are sharing problems. We have various problems of exclusion, of lack of opportunity, economic opportunity, fear, populist pressures on both sides of the Atlantic, as if we're having the same phenomenon. So I wonder if you agree with that, but you know, an ambassador's job, as far as I know, is to live on the rough edge of the policy and get through the day and make everyone think at the end of the day you're having a good day. I'm going to come back to my original question, which is, these are all maybe common challenges we're facing, but you must be facing some particular challenges when it comes to the relationship between the European Union and the United States.
Yeah, well, listening to everyone, I sort of agree. I'm reminded of Steve Hadley saying, you know, panels of this kind, we mostly admire the problem, and there is that risk. I mean, I think where I agree is that I can certainly quote the specifics of the difficulties in the relationship today. They're well known. Trade is definitely one. Climate change is another. The disagreement over Iran and the issue of sanctions, which we know is going to become even more tense in the next week or so. But I actually think that the more fundamental problem we face is sort of reinventing the transatlantic alliance in the sense of feeling that we actually have a mutual interest in helping each other to solve these problems. and redefining our place in the world, to start with Mr. Karas's intervention. I mean, and as others have mentioned, I mean, we are living through a huge change in everything, starting with technology, the rise of China, Russia. The multilateral systems which we created to try and manage this clearly are not fit for purpose in today's world. They need to be changed. In that, I think the administration is not wrong. The question is, do we work together to try and change them? Do we feel that we are, as Vice President Biden said at the Munich Security Council a couple of years ago, we are each other's best friend of first resort? I still think that is fundamentally true, but I don't think it's necessarily reciprocated just at the moment. And I think that's the difficulty, because I think the days when America and Europe agreeing on something was a sufficient condition to move the dial internationally or to change the situation at the UN or in the WTO or elsewhere are gone. I still think that for us to agree is a necessary condition for us to make progress. But I don't think that's a shared view just at the moment. Certainly not immediately shared by this administration, which, as Mr. Walker has eloquently said, you know, thinks they can leverage American power in some ways to do this alone. I believe this may have some benefits in the short term. I don't believe it's a medium-term strategy, and I think there will have to be a course correction, because you can ultimately achieve nothing without allies and friends. Equally, on the European side, I think maybe there's a slight tendency in Europe to sort of be a little bit disdainful of the new mood in America and to say, well, we can go ahead on our own without it. And I don't think that's going to work either, frankly. I think we each need this alliance. And I think the challenge in the next few years is how to kind of rebuild that convergence while managing the very real differences which we're going to have on specific policies, whether that's trade or climate change or Iran, or indeed other international issues, or the whole question of multilateralism, the whole question of whether the multilateral, what we want is a reinvigorated multilateral system, or do we want to go back to a sort of dog-eat-dog world where, you know, the biggest dog in the room is the most powerful. And personally, I think there's a very good reason why America chose the opposite path in the aftermath of the Second World War, and I still think we will come back to the need for strong functioning multilateralism to help us manage the rise of China, the huge technological changes that are coming at us, the growth of non-state actors who are increasingly threatening us more even than state actors in some cases. All of this, in my view, requires more international cooperation, not less cooperation. And that's also true of the migration issue, which frankly none of us will manage on our own. It needs a collective response and collective instruments to help address this in its various dimensions. So that to me is the biggest challenge of trying to rebuild this relationship, or reinvent it, if you like, for the 21st century.
Thank you. So everyone discussing tough issues, but being very pleasant with each other about them. So let me probe a little bit more. I mean, David had just said the relationship is indispensable. Maybe no longer, it may be insufficient these days on its own, but still indispensable. You can't get a lot of other stuff done unless you get the two sides of the Atlantic together. The President, though, has said the European Union, in his words, is a foe, an enemy, on the scale of Russia or China. And Bob, I just wonder, I mean, what's your perception, not only your personal perception, but having been in the Congress, you know, what are the views of the European Union? I mean, do people think about it at all? I mean, what's the context of that statement that the President made?
Well, I am reminded of the comment that Peter Thiel made back during the election, the San Francisco billionaire. He said that Trump's critics take him literally, but not seriously. His supporters take him seriously, but not literally. Some of these statements are aimed at making a point that he thinks that the people that he's appealing to understand. I don't really think that Donald Trump believes, and I know that the vast majority of Congress do not believe that Europe is our enemy, is a foe of equal nature to Russia or China and so on. And I think that ultimately the unity will come when we all recognize that Western culture is really under attack here. There are, China is very specific about the fact that it's attacking the principles of Western culture. Much of the Muslim world is very clear that their aim, particularly Iran as a leader, that this is something which is being done. The unity that we all have to have is around the idea that there's value in hundreds of years of Western culture and what it has been built. And the competition with those who don't share those values is going to pull us back together, or I really believe keep us together.
Well, it's good to say that we are indispensable and we share similar problems, but it's hard to get beyond to that kind of partnership if you can't deal with the problems in front of you. David referred to a problem that's coming at us next week. The sanctions on Iran are going to kick into place. There have been efforts by some European countries to create a different type of payment system to sort of go around the sanctions because the EU and particularly the members who negotiated the deal with Iran want to keep it. We have actually Stu here who helped, I know, in the Clinton administration deal with sanctions issues, including the ILSA sanctions and others at the time, which were a similar problem, actually. And Stu actually helped negotiate and navigate around those in a very creative types of ways. I just wonder, Stu, you know that this issue is coming at us. I just wondered, based on your experience, how you think we may be able to deal with that.
Well, first of all, I've tried throughout my public career to be as bipartisan and nonpartisan as possible. Obviously, a strong Democrat in the board and Democratic administrations. I really don't see, with the current mindset toward the EU, a profound change in the administration. I just don't see it. I wish I did. I don't see light at the end of the tunnel. With respect to Iran, Dan, what we did in the Clinton administration is I negotiated under the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act an exemption on secondary sanctions against European companies doing business with Iran on the condition, which we got, that the EU would take a tougher position on the shipment of dual-use products to Iran, would take a tougher position on terrorism with respect to Iran. There was a trade-off. I don't see that prospect happening. Now, I've headed the Iran task force for 6 years in the Atlantic Council. I've met with the foreign ministers Arif privately 3 times, nuclear negotiator. I think Iran is a tremendous threat to Israel, to stability in the region. It's the greatest supporter of terrorism in the world. It's destabilized Syria, which has led to this catastrophic immigration. I mean, let's look at where the problem started from. You've got 400,000 to 500,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan, but the real problem came from the civil war. Having said all of that, in my opinion, the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, is distinctly in our advantage. It's one thing to sanction them for missiles, for human rights, for terrorism. It's distinctly to our advantage. Now we're in a situation where a European company, under the JCPOA, decided by the so-called P5+1, which will try to continue to do business as the agreement permits, will be subject to secondary U.S. sanctions. Now, how does that help us when we're trying to get cooperation against China? How does it help us when we try to get a common front against Iran on the other issues? Now, I mean, even the most virulent critic of the joint agreement, the JCPOA, will say that the only reason Iran came to the negotiating table to begin with The only reason they entered into the JCPOA with all of its imperfections was because the European Union joined us in sanctions, Dan. When the EU decided they were going to withhold 16% of all of their oil imports from Iran, it was a hell of a lot more of a sacrifice for them than for us. We got zero oil from Iran. When they decided that they were going to sanction with us the Iranian central bank, when they decided that the SWIFT system in Brussels was not going to clear any transactions, that showed the Iranians that they could not devour the US and the EU. That's what brought them to the table. Could we have gotten a better deal, a better sunset deal? That's another argument. But the point is now we're going it alone. And with all the problems we already have with Europe, when we start sanctioning, and I can't see a similar waiver being granted that I was negotiated in the Clinton administration against the first European company that tries to do business with, or continues to do business with Iran, it's going to be held to that.
And probably next week. So, Othmar, I just wonder, what's the mood in Europe on this topic? I mean, how are people thinking about this? The United States decided that it had to leave the Iran deal. There seems to be tremendous commitment in Europe to stay to it, even at the risk of alienating the United States by finding workaround solutions. Do you think that's going to really happen? What's the mood? I mean, you're coming from Europe. Tell us how people are thinking about that.
First, let me make three remarks to that what you said. Firstly, to the European Union as a whole and as a project. I am fully convinced that the European Union can only tackle today's and tomorrow's challenges if it grows stronger together internally, to allow it to become even more successful externally. That is our goal. If we don't succeed as a union, we risk being crushed between the East and West, the North and South, and between Putin and Trump. And that is why the European Union must become the spokesman for the continent in the world. And that is the reason why I will support strongly the European Commission. The member states of the European Union must act with determination. We have to act instead of react. That is why I welcome the proposal from you by Commission President Juncker in his State of the Union speech to abolish anonymity in 57 different areas in the Council. Above all, this must concern the areas of foreign, security, defense and development policy, and the Commission will propose next week to have a lesser limiting majority in the decision-making process about taxation. So, if that is possible, the European Union can solve some of the problems we have internally. The second point is the multilateralism definition, the different. The third is we have also in the European Union some member states who are supporting the idea of American first. If you read the speech of President Trump at the United Nations some weeks ago, that was not a speech about daily policy, it was a doctrine. And his doctrine said very clear, the US doctrine is national sovereignty, strength and competition, and that is for me the alternative program to my understanding of multilateralism and of fairness and of cooperation. To your question, to all the crises or the challenges we are discussing here, I think you are totally right. But for me, the question is always the same. How we react as politicians. What is our responsibility to react? And my feeling is we have to react to explain the challenges to the citizens, don't play with the challenges. We have to react to defend our rules-based order, and not to act against our rules and our values. And that is the point, and that is the debate we have in the United States and also in Europe and in other continents. We have a different political answer of the governments and of the heads of states to handle the crisis. And that is why we have no more confidence to solve the crisis as political institutions. And for the last point, and that is to the transatlantic relation, and that is the feeling in the European Union, the partnership between EU and US is unique. It is based on our shared values, our strong historical ties, and the strategic partnership. The European Parliament has always been a strong advocate that both the EU and the US should maintain their constructive role as key players by jointly addressing global challenges and regional conflicts. But in the last years, we had a political shift. And one of these major new situations was coming from the United States. That was why to cancel the Paris Climate Agreement, the GSPO agreement with Iran, the possible leaving of the INF agreement, as well as the trade dispute on tariffs and the role of the WTO. And that is a lack of confidence. You mentioned it, the question is, cancel is our reaction to adopt the agreements, to make our world better, or is our answer to cancel the agreement, everybody is going his way alone, and to have a political speech and a political discussion about the bad guys and the good, and the nationalism against the multilateralism. And that is the feeling in the European Union, that this inside the European Union, look to Hungary, look to Poland, and also to the situation at the United States. And that is the point why we have new ring of friends, and that is the situation why we have problems in the situation where we will divide it and not unite it.
If I might, part of the problem here is that the agreements that we make, we refuse to take to Congress to ratify because it's too hard. You know, the Iran agreement, the climate agreement, all of these agreements and so on, everybody gets together and they agree with them. In this country,
you were the part of these agreements.
But the executive branch signs it.
The executive branch signs it, and it, you know, in the case of treaties, they are supposed to be ratified by the Congress. So the administration says, well, we're going to do an agreement in large part so we don't have to take it to the Congress, and because we don't think it will pass in the Congress.
That is not the problem of the agreement. That is the
problem of the decision. You have to use the microphone, otherwise.
That is not the problem of the agreement. That is the problem of the decision-making process and the consequences.
But the point being, though, that our administration should not be out making agreements that they don't believe that they can get ratified in the Congress, because at the end of the day, the reason why you have a lot of dissension that arises is because those agreements did not have popular support. The Iran agreement did not have popular support, in large part because the public saw a country that was sponsoring terrorism all the way across the world, was murdering people, and we saw it nightly on the TVs. People didn't think that making an agreement with that particular country was a very wise idea. And yet Secretary of State Kerry was absolutely maniacal about the idea he was going to get an agreement out of this and so on, and knew from the outset that he wasn't going to take it to Congress because he knew it wouldn't pass. Same thing with the climate agreement. The climate agreement was made by the executive branch. There was no intent whatsoever of taking it to the Congress because the Senate had already voted 96 to nothing. Or 96 to 3, I think it was.
95 to 0.
95 to 0, okay. They all already voted to say that they weren't willing to approve it. And so the point I'm making is that when you say that these agreements are things that should be accepted in our system, that they would be accepted if they were in fact negotiated in a way that they could be ratified by the appropriate bodies of the Congress.
Right. Just, I'm not sure, because we have many international visitors here, and just in terms of the structure of the United States, you need a 2/3 majority in the U.S. Senate to approve formal treaties. So while the executive branch does sign lots of things, it's not 2/3. Not 2/3. Big bar, very high bar if you look at the complexion of our politics. So it's a very high bar, and this is often a problem. And it's not partisan. It's across the board. The executive branch tends to want to sign executive agreements or push their authority in the executive, but when it comes down to anchoring it into a executive legislative consensus, it's hard. Doesn't mean you can't do it. We do it, but it's not the thing. I just want to not leave David out here.
One point. We are both parliamentarians, and I understand your comment very well. But this process must be finished before the agreement was signed and read. This process, the politicians of the member states, the politicians of the country of the United States, have to know how far they can go and where are the difficulties in the whole process. If you sign an agreement and you are not ready to have the majority in the national parliament, it's unfair to your partners. It's unfair to the citizens outside, the United States. I understand you very well. But we had multilateral agreements, and now we have a new government, a new president, and he is killing these agreements. And that gives, in times of challenges, is it an act against the global and multilateral confidence between and transatlantic relationship between the US and the European Union? You are right, internal, but I am also right in defend the agreement outside the United States and together with the European Union.
But at the end of the day, if you don't have consensus in the country, you are going to have sometimes a change of administration that takes the new consensus in the country and applies it to our international relations. That's the reality of our government.
I know, but that is the reality is also how we inform in which way we work together. And so it is important to have a strong dialogue, to discuss the difficulties we have, not to make a press release or a tweet and tell the partners what's going on.
Let me just tell you one thing. You know, I look at this relationship. I look at all the networks we have across the Atlantic with each other institutionally, and I have to say, in my view, the weakest link across the Atlantic is between exactly the U.S. Senate and the European Union. There isn't a link. We have a network called the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. It was created, Stu helped create it, but it's only with the House of Representatives. And it's not even a formal type of thing. The speaker has to go find people who kind of get on a plane and maybe talk to their counterparts. I'm sorry to say that. And the Senate is not involved in this. and there is no mechanism, David, you correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no mechanism at all with the US Senate. And when 2/3 of the Senate have to approve the treaties, here's an issue. This is an issue. And if I look at this, I've always found when we get the treaties done, it has tended to be because whoever has been our negotiator has understood your point and has brought members of Congress with them. Robert Strauss, when he negotiated the Tokyo round on the W2 long gap long ago, he had a whole group of members of the Senate with him as part of the U.S. team, really. They helped sell it later. When we had to do NATO enlargement, there was something called the Senate NATO Observer Group. It was a bipartisan group. It exists again to help sell it. So I think in just explaining the American domestic context, usually the most effective efforts have been to acknowledge this point. But given our politics today, the tendency for executive branches to say, let's ram full speed ahead with our agenda, and then we'll see what we can do. But I don't want to let David off the hook here, because I'm coming back to this around sanctions. Because you have to deal with that.
I really want to add something on the treaty point. Bob is quite right about executive agreements. But there has been a tradition for decades that incoming presidents, even of a different party, respect the executive agreements their predecessors. So, for example, the SALT II treaty, which we reached in the Carter administration, which I write about in my new book on the Carter administration, was never ratified by the Senate, in large part because of the discovery of the sort of red herring of Soviet troops in the treaty, but it wasn't. Ronald Reagan, for the entire duration of the SALT treaty, enforced it, as did the Soviet Union, explicitly, as if it had been ratified, because he wanted to establish the principle that when a president of the United States makes an agreement, except in the most extraordinary circumstances, his successor should abide by it. That's been broken.
Let me, David, the issue in front of us in the real time, among many, but the Iran sanctions issue. The effort of Europeans to sort of do the workaround, how realistic is that really going to be? How do you have to deal with this in terms of your daily workings?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think Mr. Black, Mr. Walker's made a very good point about, the constitutional situation in the US. We know this. I think the difficulty for your allies is how does that then work? I mean, can we ever do anything that's going to work between us? I think it's not just a question of telling us that this is how your system works, it's a question of figuring out, I mean, for trade negotiations, you actually have a sort of fast-track mandate of TPA. I think you maybe need to invent something similar for the kind of other negotiations that you would have. The idea that the Iran deal would have to come back and be negotiated in a way that it could be amended or changed or something, it's inconceivable. So I think somehow this is a shared problem, but we need to find a solution. Now on the Iran, Stu has very eloquently, I mean, we are in this unfortunate situation where we are in diametrically opposed positions. The United States has withdrawn from the agreement negotiated in good faith by the rest of us with the previous administration. And frankly, it seems to be determined to destroy that agreement with a view to, we think, building some kind of super new agreement which will cover this and everything else. And in the process of doing that, feels free to impose maximum sanctions, including with secondary consequences. The European Union and the other signatories to the agreement, which has been ratified, let us be clear, by the UN Security Council, and so it is now an international agreement with international status. The rest of us actually feel bound by that agreement. And that agreement requires us to continue to have economic and commercial contacts with Iran as long as they abide by the extremely rigorous and strenuous constraints of the nuclear deal on their nuclear activities. I'm not going to get into now whether it's a good deal or not. The fact remains, it is a non-proliferation agreement of unprecedented intrusiveness. There has never been such a degree of surveillance or intrusiveness in any non-proliferation agreement. And as long as Iran abides by that, which it still is abiding by, the rest of us who are signatories to it feel obliged in good faith to continue to give Iran the benefit of sanctions relief. The United States is determined that there will be no sanctions relief. And that is where we are now stuck. So when people say, oh, the Europeans are trying to work around US sanctions, no, we're not trying to work around US sanctions. We are trying to deliver on our side of an international agreement whose primary objective is to prevent Iran from ever obtaining nuclear weapons. And let us face it, however, the challenges of Iran, the ballistic missiles, the support for terrorism, the attacks on Israel, the generally unhelpful behavior in the region, take all of that and throw in a nuclear-armed Iran, and you have a radically different equation. So for the Europeans, making sure Iran, whatever else happens, does not acquire nuclear weapons is an issue of vital security. And we believe in order to do that, we have to continue to allow Iran to have some economic benefit from the deal. So we are trying to find ways the market will decide what our companies do in response to secondary sanctions. We cannot make companies make the choice that they prefer to do business with Iran rather than to do business in the United States. Total, the French oil company, has divested from Iran because they have too big an interest here in the United States. Their place has been taken by China. That's the net effect of what has happened. The largest oil field in Iran is now managed by Chinese interests. A great success for Western economic policy. We will do all that we can to find ways to continue economic and commercial activity with Iran through small and medium-sized companies who are not exposed to the United States, through allowing special payment channels. The tragedy of this situation, and this is my final point, the tragedy of this situation is that the United States, through this policy, is driving for the first time a deep wedge between the United States and the European Union on sanctions. And that has always been our strongest strength in relation with Russia elsewhere. And this is a byproduct of the policy of this administration, which I believe will come back to haunt us in years to come, and which will be deeply regretted, particularly by policymakers in America.
So let me just respond in a couple of ways, because I agree with the substantial amount. First of all, we have relied on the EU to get Iran to the bargaining table to begin with, which I mentioned. We rely on the EU for sanctions against Russia, which have to be rolled over every 6 months by the EU. Now, how does it help us get cooperation from the EU on Russian sanctions if we end up sanctioning European companies that are doing business with Iran as permitted by the JCPOA? Number three, and David, I'm sorry to say this, all the actions which are being taken by the EU to find alternative payment systems and so forth, at the end of the day, will not replace the power of the United States. It just won't. I'm sorry to say that. I wish it could. It will not.
In the short term.
Well, and, you know, as Keynes said, in the long term, we're all dead.
There's a medium term.
So, I mean, in the short term, yes. So Total has already pulled out, as you said. There's not one European financial institution that would dare do business with Iran, because if they do, they will lose their opportunity to transact business with the largest financial market in the world, in the United States. So these secondary sanctions have already begun to have an impact, and they will erode those within Iran who negotiated the deal at the expense of the most radical elements who were opposed to the deal to begin with. Now again, nobody has to tell me about Iran. Nobody has to tell me about their danger. But I'm telling you, having said that it is distinctly in our national security interest to keep that nuclear agreement, because it would completely destroy their heavy water system. It took 2/3 2/3 of their centrifuges out, making enriched uranium. It doesn't permit them to have weapons-grade uranium. It has 24/7 inspections with cameras and intrusive involvement. I mean, there's never been an agreement like this. You know, President Reagan said, trust but verify. That's what the JCPOA does. But we are in a really very, very difficult situation now in which, even without sanctions, a whole host of European companies and financial institutions won't do business with Iran, and those who have the temerity to do so will get hit over the head.
Let me, another pleasant topic of the day, trade. So when we load onto all of this, yet another issue that we're facing across the Atlantic, where the President and the administration putting on tariffs, steel, aluminum, and then President meeting Commission President Juncker in the summer, sort of declaring a trade truce, and since then, there's been quite a bit of back and forth across the Atlantic on let's find another way. And there have been many interesting comments of recent months and weeks that maybe the U.S. and the EU will, in fact, chart a new way. USTR Lighthizer has sent a note to the Congress saying want to negotiate again with the EU on a trade deal. But there's still the potential of other sanctions being imposed on European companies under the national security exemption that the President would like to say he can impose. So, David, how do we think about this? What are the prospects for moving on the trade front? What are you concerned about? Where do you think we might find some positive news here?
Madeleine Albright says she's an optimist, but an optimist who worries a lot. So I'm an optimist about our trade talks, but who worries a lot. I think that we are engaged in a good conversation. I don't know exactly where it will end. I think we have a fundamental disagreement, let's be clear, about the nature of the problem. Stu alluded to it. We do not believe that trade deficits are, by definition, a proof of unfair trading conditions. They are much more the factor of macroeconomic factors. The United States has a trade deficit for just about everyone. That trade deficit is going to increase massively because of the current economic policy, irrespective of anything that is done on the trade policy front. There is no correction that this administration can do through trade deals that would stop the trade deficit from rising significantly in the years to come because of the macroeconomic policy. Having said that, if there are issues between us, we're willing to discuss them. I mean, but the fact remains that while there is a deficit in surplus on the European side of about $150 billion, there is a surplus on the US side of $50 billion in goods. There's a surplus on the US side of $50 billion in services. That leaves you with $100 billion. If you take primary income, which is a very important index of profits made by American companies invested in Europe and profits made by European companies invested in the United States, there is a surplus in America's favor of $100 billion. So in fact, when you look at it in macroeconomic terms, this is actually a very balanced relationship. American companies make more money out of trading with Europe and investing in Europe than they do with any other place in the world. So we do not believe that the starting point is an unfair trading relationship. Can we do things better? Can we improve that relationship? Can we address issues of mutual concern? And I emphasize mutual concern. We hope so. That's how we're engaged. We're taking up where we left off in the TTIP negotiations on a number of issues, whether this is regulatory, whether this is some specific issues like soybeans or LNG, or whether this is the possibility of a first phase limited free trade agreement limited to industrial products only. We are willing to explore all of this if it can contribute to an improved atmosphere. It's absolutely clear if there were to be, we have agreed to let stand the existing tariffs on steel and aluminium and our rebalancing tariffs in response to that on both sides. We would like to see this got rid of. We will see what happens. It is absolutely clear that if there were to be either the threat or the reality of further unilateral tariffs under 232 on auto tariffs. This would be the end of the negotiations, and we would move into a completely different phase. We will not negotiate under threat or with new tariffs new tariffs. So that truce has to hold for these talks to deliver. We understand that these talks should not take forever. We are trying to move as quickly as possible, but equally there are, as Mr. Walker reminded us, there are procedures on the US side, the TPA, the role of Congress. There is now a kind of PERDA on discussions about trade talks until such time as Congress has sort of finished its reflection, and the USTR has given more detail to Congress. So we'll have to see how we do that. We will need, if the Commission wishes to propose to negotiate a free trade agreement on industrial products, we will need a mandate from the Member States, so the Commission will have to propose that, and of course we will, as always, consult fully with the European Parliament as part of that process. So that's where we are. I think there is grounds for good progress to be made on both sides, but one thing needs to be absolutely clear: we do not feel that we are in a position of weakness or inferior, or that we somehow have to give lots of concessions in order to make progress. This has to be a two-way traffic. Any deal will have to be ratified by our Member States and by the European Parliament. So it has to be a deal which is saleable to us, as it must be a deal which, of course, is saleable to the US side. We understand that.
We talked a bit about the difficulties domestically within the United States with treaties, but we think about this process you just alluded to for the European Union. There's also a process. And I just wonder whether the political window might be closing on the European process. David mentioned if you decide to go with a free trade agreement with the United States, the Commission has to propose, it has to go to the European Parliament for some consultation, and all the member states will have to sign up again. 28 countries sign up again for a new mandate to the Commission to negotiate. You have European parliamentary elections in May, and then there will be a new Commission. So I just wonder, Othmar, I mean, how realistic is this, that the Europeans could actually deliver on any mandate for a trade negotiation? And do you think there's even any appetite, given the sort of all the political toxicity that we've been talking about?
If we have the political will.
That's the question.
If we have the political will, it can be realistic. I think at the moment, not everybody has the political will to do it. But I think we have to do it. And it must be also a point in the election campaign. Which Europe we want? What is the future of the European Union? Which political projects?
Can I just interrupt you? Are you going to campaign now that it's really important to get a trade negotiation with Donald Trump? Is that how you're going to campaign for the European Parliament?
The most important, I made a campaign in 2014 to support TTIP and a trade agreement with the United States, and they won the elections. But also the other group who was against, but she was upon also. But that what we have to learn is, I think, especially in the European Union, I don't know enough about the situation in the United States. We have to discuss publicly what we need and what we want and what we feel is the best way for the future of the continent and the world. We politicians have to go to the public. We have to include our citizens in the political debate and in the political process. We are discussing publicly too less, and we are working too much in closing rooms. And that is the reason. And I think that is what you mentioned before. My feeling is we have more delegations from the European Parliament in New York and in Washington as members of the Senate and the House of Congress in Brussels and in Strasbourg. So we have to intensify the dialogue between the parliamentarians, and we have to make this dialogue public, and we have to explain the citizens, and we have to go directly to the citizens what's going on, why we need something, where are the difficulties, and we have to support and fight for compromises. We have to explain compromises, we have to understand another better, and we need more public dialogue. And we need more responsibility to solve the problems and less games and plays with the problems of the citizens. Yes, I think we have a chance. We don't have a chance before the European election. Now, after the European election, it can be much more difficult than now. But I think the meeting of President Juncker with President Trump in Washington was also publicly, I hope in the United States in the same way as in the European Union, it was a success. It was the feeling publicly that here are two presidents who understand another and they are willing to find a compromise and not blaming another.
Yeah, David.
No, just to be clear, to launch a mandate for a tariff-only free trade agreement requires a qualified majority of member states only, which is not. Of course, we will consult the Parliament, because at the end of the day, we will need the Parliament to ratify it, so we're not going to launch something which, but I mean, the precise procedural step is we need a qualified majority of member states to approve a negotiating mandate, which then we turn into an agreement which needs to be ratified, of course, by the newly elected European Parliament whenever that agreement is negotiated. So it's not quite as complicated as you made it sound.
Right. But let me ask you one other question. I had to go to the Congress and talk about trade and so on. And when I'm there, the energy I feel, especially among Republican members, is that the real trade deal that they want is with UK. The president has said Brexit is a great thing. And the energy is, let's get a bilateral deal with the UK as quickly as we can. And the USTR has also submitted a letter to that effect as well. So just, what's your take on Brexit and how the United States should think about that? Is that a good thing for the US interests? Is this an opportunity for us or something else?
Well, look, the president said from the outset, back during the campaign, that he was more interested in doing bilateral agreements than he was in multilateral agreements. And so I think we have a real issue there. However, he has also said that he regards the European Union as a collective that is in a sense a bilateral agreement as long as you are dealing with all the nations as a collective. And I think part of the issue here that needs to be recognized is that some of the people in the Congress who would vote against these kinds of deals are people who, if Donald Trump signs on to them, will go with them because they don't want to go against the president. Some of the very conservative elements in the Congress who might otherwise oppose a deal made could be persuaded by Trump. And in dealing with Trump, what you need to understand is that he is in large part a tabloid president. He grew up seeking headlines in tabloids. He goes for a few things that are the headline items. Why did he call the deal with Canada the greatest deal ever, and so on? Because he got a reduction in the tariffs on dairy. Dairy is a big deal for him in the Midwest, and so if he brought that down and so on, he got a good deal, greatest deal in the history of the world. So if you approach it in the same way, I mean, he's already said one of the things that he's concerned about is a 25% tariff on American cars going into Europe. Most of the European companies have already now said that they're prepared to have that reduced. There's a place where the headline will fit with him. I would say to the Europeans, if you're going to negotiate with them, make certain you negotiate the right things on agriculture. I know that's tough, But doing the right things on agriculture means that his Midwestern base is in fact taken care of. And so, if in fact you want to get a deal, I think a deal can be had, and I think it's a deal that he is prepared to sell to Congress. There are hurdles in all that. And with regard to Brexit, I think that many in the Congress are awakening to the fact that Brexit is substantially more complicated than what was recognized in the earliest days. I think even some of the British are recognizing that. But the fact is that there was considerable support here, in large part because they believed that a bilateral deal was possible. I'm not so certain that there's as much enthusiasm these days for Brexit as there was some months ago.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to the audience and have some comments. So could we do that, Torsten? Is there a mic? Those two mics? We will share the mics, and we will give the mics to. So we do have mics. If you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, can I ask you to say who you are so our panelists understand? And then just, if you can, be brief so that we can have some other people. Yes, way back here. Wait for the mic, please. Yeah. Microphone, right here. I'm sorry, right here. This gentleman who's been standing and waiting. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jacob Levitian. I was wondering if I could kind of move this a little bit further to the east with Russia and Russian-EU, American-Russia-West relations. So it seems, at least to me, that the Russian government, at least, is kind of taking a new Eurasian cultural, hostile attitude towards the West and more of a Eurasia versus Europe mindset. And I was wondering, in this background, does the EU have any kind of strategy to face Russia?
Okay. What I'd like to do is collect a few comments so that our panelists can respond to the ones that they want. There was a woman back here where you have the mic, please?
Yes, I do. Hi, I'm Shima from George Washington University. I'm a student there, and this comment is for Mr. Sullivan and everybody else on the panel. I think the tragedy that will come and haunt you is that the European countries closing their eyes on human rights violation in Iran. Just yesterday, Iranian government sentenced 50 workers union to lashes. Women, students, teachers, everybody who has the slightest opposition to the Iranian government will go to jail. And this has been, the Iranian people have been feeling this way even before the sanctions and before the JCPOA. So don't you think it's time for the European countries to stop supporting this government and maybe hear the Iranian people out? Because that tragedy will haunt you.
Okay, we have Russia, Iran. We have another question also back here, please.
My name is Alok Srivastava. I am a technical fellow in a defense corporation in Washington, D.C. I am not sure it is an appropriate question in the Austrian embassy, but overall, because the EU leaders are here, my question is related to the role of NATO. And the Russian leader is finding way to remain in the power, either to a president or prime minister, same way the things happen in Ukraine and all that, So there's a very large American presence in Europe because of NATO, and there's a lot of pressure on the taxpayers like me in USA, we take care of the expenses for the NATO. So what the general mood is or the perspective that EU member wanted to contribute more towards the expenses of with this organization, or they expect the US to continue supporting that, taking care of their security needs, considering the Russia is very powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll be happy to ask our Austrian colleagues about their contribution to NATO. So, right here, this gentleman right here. Yes, I know.
My name is Devin. My question is concerning populism in modern society. Do you all foresee change or in the tide of populism, and if not, what conditions would be necessary to bring about that change in the tide?
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we've gathered quite a few. We have a number of topics. I go back to the panel. Don't feel compelled to answer every question, but those that you feel that are important. David, I think that one was directed right at you, so I just maybe you want to start. And Othmar, you know a lot on Russia, and maybe, but I'll come back there, please.
And you know, on Iran, look, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was designed to do one thing, to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. We have lots of problems with Iran. I can join in everything you say about the human rights situation, about their behavior in the region, about their support for terrorism. We just saw an incident recently in Denmark. We had one previously in France. This is not about saying we like the Iranian regime. It's about saying the only thing worse than the current Iranian regime would be a nuclear-armed Iran. And everyone agreed on that, by the way. The entire international community, with very few exceptions, agreed that preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons was an issue not only of regional but of global security. The deal secured that. It's a deal. The Iranians have signed up to certain very difficult conditions that Stu has mentioned in terms of dismantling their nuclear program, in terms of inspections. They are respecting it. The other side of the deal, and a deal is a deal, was that they would get some sanctions relief as part of that. We are only saying we have to respect the deal. We have sanctions against Iran on human rights. We never lifted them. We have sanctions limited to ballistic missiles. We have technology transfer restrictions, arms embargo with Iran, all as part of our ongoing disagreements with Iran on many issues. The tragedy of what's happened with the JCPOA is that unfortunately it is much more difficult for the US and the EU to cooperate on jointly addressing the other issues while we are at loggerheads over how we deal with the JCPOA. So I fully take your point, but we do make those comments and we do condemn them and we do raise these issues of human rights with the Iranians. By the way, as we raise them everywhere in the world where we see problems of human rights, and we're very tough on this. But you also have to accept that you still have to do business if you want to achieve the objective of preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. And I'll just, if I make one point about Russia, it's the same thing. We have many things that we profoundly disagree with Mr. Putin on, including the illegal annexation of Crimea, the interference in the eastern provinces, and the unacceptable behavior of Russia, the failure of Russia to implement the Minsk agreements and the failure to cooperate, the threats which are made elsewhere in the region, the interference in elections. These are points of profound disagreement. Russia's behavior in Syria. These are points of profound disagreement. That's why we have sanctions. That's why we continue to push back. But the fact remains, Russia is also a partner on the international stage. They are a permanent member of the Security Council, and they cannot be ignored. We have to also be willing to cooperate and to work with Russia in areas where we believe we can find areas of common interest or where it suits us to work with them. That is, I think, the European position. It's not a pure position, because frankly, in politics and diplomacy, purity doesn't find a comfortable place. The United States is in exactly the same slightly schizophrenic position of wanting to push back on many issues, but also needing to work with Russia. That is the reality of the modern interconnected world. You have to stand by your principles, you have to be firm on certain things, and on the other hand, you have to be willing to make some compromises and to get your hands a little dirty in order to attain the better good through outcomes which ultimately are in all our best interests. That's true in Iran, it's true with Russia, and I think it's the reality of the modern interconnected world. I won't touch on some of the other issues. I'm even less well placed to comment on NATO since I'm Irish, so you're not in luck tonight.
We're asking the Austrians and Irish, but let me come back to Russia, Othmar, and also since you are a politician in Europe, the question about populism, especially if I could say you're a politician from Austria in Europe, and I just wonder if you, since we haven't really even brought in the Austrian dimension here, anything you could tell us about that topic and it relates to your own country. But Russia, I know you also wanted to say something.
I think populists are everywhere. That is our problem. Populists not only on the right and on the left. We have populists also in the center. And we have realized very clear the right and left populists, the anti-Europeans, are not in the majority in the European Union. And they are not in the majority in Austria, they are not in the majority in other member states. We have around 20 to 25, maximum 30% of anti-Europeans, of nationalists and populists. They are in a minority. And we have to push, we have to encourage the majority to go forward. Our problem at the moment is we have too much politicians who are only discussing with the populists and with the extreme right and the left and not with the citizens of the majority. We have to go forward. That is my point. And we have to recognize that the populists and the nationalists are a minority, and that they are not the face of Austria, they are not the face of the European Union. And we have to look how we can strengthen the majority, how we can organize a high number of voters of the pro-Europeans. Look to the Brexit. The Brexit had no chance if the young people will go to vote. Yeah, that was the problem. And the problem of the referenda in Macedonia was also that we had a majority, but we don't have a majority of the voters. And that is our problem in democracy. The second point is populists trigger fears and instrumentalize the feeling of unfairness to gain an advantage. They utilize political actions by external actors such as Vladimir Putin, also Mr. Strache in Austria, or Donald Trump and others, to support the destructive political agenda. That we have to say, what are the instruments of the nationalists? What are the instruments of the populist? And I am optimistic. If we are willing to discuss with the people the challenges in the world and in our member states and in our region, and how we discuss with our citizens what we have to do together to solve our problems, to give the right answer, then we have the majority of the people, responsible people, of the Democrats on our side. And that is my message to this point. My second point is, but we have to change our party-oriented and national-oriented policy. I think at the moment we are discussing common challenges, but we give too much national and party-oriented and electoral day-oriented answers. And that is wrong. We have to create a common atmosphere to solve the problems and for that. The second point is, you said a moment to NATO. I think in the European Union, we understand the signals. We have to do our job. We have to strengthen the defense and security policy of the European Union. The NATO is one pillar. We are defending the NATO. I think NATO is a very important part also of the Transatlantic Partnership. I will say it also very clear as Austrian. We are not neutral in the European Union. We are part of the European Union, we are responsible, and we are also part of the development of a common security and defense policy inside the European Union. That is one of the first challenges we have to do in the next years, and it is one of the points, I mentioned it before, where the Commission proposed to go from the unlimited majority to a democratic two-thirds or others, a double majority of the citizens and majority of the regions. To Russia, I believe that there can only be peace in Europe with and not without Russia. But we have with Russia the same problem as with some international agreements with the United States. Russia ignores the international agreements, the international law, the Helsinki Agreement, the Budapest Agreement, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the Eastern and South Ukraine, under Crimea, and so on. And we have to react. Some citizens of the European Union, especially the citizens from the Baltic states and the former member states of the Soviet Union, are angry, are worried, and they ask the European Union to defend their interests. Not only politically, not only economically, we have to defend their position also at the security level. And our answer, sanctions, we have to defend our principles on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have to create platforms of dialogue. And one point more we have, that you must know. We don't have only a problem with Russia on the level of sanctions and on the Crimea, in Syria, or in Ukraine, or in Georgia, or others. We have a strong connection between Russia and the center and the far-right political parties. We have a strong influence of Russia on the cyber war level. The intervention of Russia on the Brexit issue, the intervention of Russia in Moldavia, on the referendum in Moldavia, the intervention of Russia in Spain, in Catalonia, the intervention of Russia on the Baltic states, especially Serbia and others, has one political goal: to divide the European Union and to destroy the European project. That is, on the other side, a problem we have, and we have to react to this. We must be more independent than in the past, and we cannot be naive as we were in the past.
I'd like to take the populist thing on. It's a very important question, and I believe that when you add to it what's going to happen in the next 10 years with artificial intelligence, with the displacement that's going to occur, it's a prescription for increased populism unless we act appropriately. So let me be both descriptive and prescriptive. Those of us who believe in a more integrated, interdependent world with alliances across the Atlantic have lost the narrative. Plain and simple, have lost the narrative. And we've lost the narrative because we have failed to understand the legitimate problem that working class people, white and black, have. Figure, 2016 election, 200 counties in the industrial Midwest, which decisively decided the election. Predominantly white counties, which voted once or twice for a black candidate in 2008 and a black president in 2012, flipped and voted for Donald Trump. Because he understood the pain that they were suffering when we did not. Didn't even campaign in those areas, which Obama did. Second, we have to have positive responses to those problems. And those positive responses have to be understanding the flat incomes, have tax policies which don't reward the most wealthy, as the tax bill that just passed. Focus on those who have the greatest needs, jobs and job training, infrastructure programs that relate to the concerns of those people, and most important, and I want to be very blunt about this, those of us who believe in a more integrated, open world have to address the immigration issue head on and directly. And I believe that a presidential candidate in 2012 who says, I understand your problems, but I am not going to stoke polarization and division. I'm going to appeal to the better angels of this country I'm going to seek bipartisan solutions. I think there is a desperation in this country for someone who will try to reach bipartisan agreements. And there is a bipartisan agreement to be reached on immigration, and Bob knows that we came very close numerous times to it. And that bipartisanship has to indicate that those of us who believe in a more integrated world don't believe in open borders with no tests. We believe in legal immigration. This administration wants to cut it in half. That legal immigrants are vital to this country. We believe there should be controls at the border for people who are illegally in. We should believe that those who want to come to this country, if they are legitimate refugees and they have a well-founded fear of persecution, that's what this country's all about. That's where my relatives got in. And that's where people who were barred during World War II. But they have to have a legitimate fear of persecution by race, gender, or religion. Not because they have a boyfriend back in Honduras who's going to beat them up if they go back. That's not what the immigration laws are designed to do. So we have to separate out the legals and increase. We have to say for those who want to come here have a legitimate fear of persecution under asylum, they should be welcome. They should go through an asylum process. But we are not here to simply have economic migrants. And we have to be able to take that on directly and honestly. Or populism will continue to flourish for decades to come.
Yeah, 3 quick points. I am very much in favor of what Stu said about legal immigration. I mean, that's the way in which we get back to where we should be in this country and assure that people have an opportunity to come here, but to come here for all the right reasons. On populism, I think that we reduce the chances of it dominating the political world when the people who have fears about their future recognize that they have opportunities in the future. And so we've got to create the opportunities for them to reduce the amount of fear. On Iran, one of the problems with the Iranian agreement was the fact that it was an actual problem in terms of human rights when we load a plane full of gold bars and pallets of money and send it to Iran. The fact is that most of that money went in support of terrorism around the world. And on Russia, look, Russia is a third world economy. They are a first world military power, but they're a third world economy that is largely propped up by their energy sales. The more we can do to assure that people are not buying huge amounts of energy from Russia, the more we will assure that they have to come to the table and negotiate. And so it was very good news recently when Germany announced that they were going to buy a lot of LNG from the United States to offset some of the Russian supply. Those kinds of things, I think, will help us enormously.
I'm told that we should bring this part of the evening to a close, but we're going to have a discussion later and you can interact with the panelists. So on this Halloween night, I was thinking about the tenor of this conversation. I hope we didn't spook you too much, but in the end it occurred to me it's more like Thanksgiving. Because it was more like a family get-together, some quarrels, maybe some relatives you weren't sure about, but in the end, I think we advanced the conversation a little bit. So please join me before I ask Eva to come up to thank the panelists. Please.